Okay, I'm going to take you through looking at sort of vintage beginnings of packaging. So I think the what this should do is sort of give you a bit of a cross section, a little bit of uh, a real sort of deep dive on what makes a vintage package uh, vintage. So there's all different levels of vintage, and there's also all different sort of areas where vintage packaging comes from. So I think just going over a few of the real basic items that makes up a vintage label or vintage package in general, I think will help. So um, let's start with sort of different eras because when we look at vintage packaging or vintage labels, some of them can look very modern and with just a hint of sort of a vintage label. So if we look at this Birmingham gin, um, this is probably the simplest, most elegant approach you could have with still having a nod to it being vintage. So we have basically a vintage looking label, couple rules, really tracked out serif, and then a few different changes. In weight. Now that being said, look at the way they've surrounded it with other things, sort of like this halftone pattern, this sort of B, to sort of stand for Birmingham. That is 180 degrees from Sonoma Brothers Distilling, which really gets the vintage aspect of this from Victorian sort of very ornate packaging from England, in the late 1800s. So this type of vintage it really is very distinctive, and you will not see these types of labels unless you want it to be purely from that era. So this era, some of the things that I've gone over in the past is there's a lot of flourishes, there's a lot of patterning, very sort of integrated type and balance that goes on between the crest, the patterns, and the type. Whereas something like this, it just really has a nod to being vintage. So all of these, have sort of different levels. So if you think about, the gin, sort of the next level from there is now taking that sort of same rule pattern, and you'll notice on the side that there's a little bit of a bolder text. Now they switched to sans serif, a change in weight of the rules, and a couple breaks, a couple different layers of text, right? And then Bindle, if you sort of look where this came from and then where this ended up, it looks modern, but the actual typeface is quite modern. This crest is a dead giveaway to a vintage sort of label, so not unlike where these ones actually came from, but it has such little reference to it that it now becomes quite a bit more modern. And then the Bus Gin is what I want you to really pay attention to here is this becomes very pure label. Again, it goes back to sort of Victorian influenced time, so very sort of English illustration in the background. Some of the things that really make this work and I want you to really pay attention to some of these things, is when they're setting up these rules here, look at the change in weight, in numbers, some of the abbreviations, the change in typefaces, and then some of the flourishes that they add. So under Jin, and look at how many change in typefaces there are just right there. So that is a dead giveaway, and it's those sort of flourishes and changes in weight that really sort of give it the that look and feel. And then St. Archer's is a much more, so if this is very Victorian, right? St. Archer is more, it would be more influence from design in the United States in the 50s, where there's these sort of heavy borders, there's these large sans serifs, there's some script in there, so you can see the rules on each side of the script. So this is a very distinctive look on its own, but it's vintage, but it's not the same type of vintage as this. And then to sort of carry that over a little bit further, this again is more sort of obviously Western vintage. So, it has a very distinct look, and it can end up having a very modern feel to it, even though it comes from an era that was probably in the 40s and 50s, and very sort of Western influence. And then again, this is sort of the a take on the very sort of sophisticated rule system, where you create a system of rules to break up information. You use changes in serifs, you track them out. You add different sort of sizing and flourishes. So again, that is not unlike here. Here, what I would like you to really pay attention to is, again, look at the change in weight, look at the little flourishes, look at the little look at how the type is set up. So even in these tiny little places, there's these little arcs of type, and then a number, and then a little bit of type underneath it. And it's the detail that goes into these things that makes it believable, right? And then again, more a little bit more back to the a bit of a Western feel, but the same sort of thing. Lots of changes in weight on the type, lots of little flourishes, little sort of almost logos within logos that sort of dress these things up, and you can really see it on 825. Now, the reason I pulled out 825 is this kind of falls into it is a very vintage feel to it, but it actually has Middle Eastern ties to the vintage. So if you look at the patterning around Pico, and this framing system is very much sort of Middle Eastern, but it's still with the numbers and the typeface and the boxes, it still has a very vintage feel. And then the Anchorcraft beer one, now we're doing the same system, but we're using completely modern typefaces to create almost a modern take on that vintage feel. So the rule system still works. All the little icons, all the little sort of logos within logos. So little areas where they balance off the area onto itself, and then balance it within a larger area. So those are the things to really look for. And then some of the attention to sort of this is very much government sort of form based, but look at how many changes in type there is, how many little areas that have their own sort of type, under rules, using arrows, balancing it in a very symmetrical way, and then sort of taking that same idea and then adding illustration to it to actually give it a much more modern feel. And so, as you sort of go through these ones, you can see that they're using these same sort of systems. So these little rules and these little lines are the exact same thing. It's creating little sections of type that then work within a larger canvas, right? So it's really sort of prevalent in this gin packaging. So if you have a look here, look at the way that they've sort of broken up these areas to almost be almost columns of text that have different text, have different marks, have little areas where there's these X's and numbers. It's those types of things that will give your topography on packaging that is influenced by the vintage sort of movement. And this is the type of thing, all these little areas in here, like the 61/302, those give it a kind of a funky sort of modern feel, even though it comes from a place of it being very vintage. And then again, just going back, and again, now we're sort of looking at Victorian design, where the letter forms were originally actually drawn out, and then everything was sort of considered in these very ornate. Don't consider doing this, just because it literally is impossible to do unless you are an artist who loves doing it. It is so hard to do, so hard to accomplish, and so time consuming that you could do one label in an entire semester. So here's the T1 again, and then just going through a few sort of variations. So copperfish, same sort of thing, right? Lots of white space, nice color breaks around the box, but look at the little logo within a logo on the yellow on this one, right? So a circle breaking up, couple icons, some numbers, and then this rule system on the front, changes in type, making it look industrial, and then giving itself enough space and a very modern serif at the top. So using vintage, but also giving it a modern feel. And then you can sort of see some variations on that. So in Sticky Fingers, it's actually taking it's actually distressing it, using some hand rendered elements in those areas. So the box with the rules through it is the very easiest thing to do. It's some of the other areas where it will make your design come to life. So again, with this one, look at the 10th logo around there. So it's got lots of areas of interest. Same as here. So using circles with numbers in it, balancing the text. So. And then here's one that is completely different, right? It keeps the rule system completely simple, but just by using this arc and this symmetry and these numbers, it gives it a very much of a vintage feel. And the milk float is very much 1950s inspired. So you can sort of see this really kind of vintage. I'm not sure what the typeface is, but a script. And then this whiskey one, same sort of thing. Some really, really interesting areas in here. So, look at some of the numbers, like the 0, 2, and this, the sets of types, the percentages, the bottle dates, and then look up at the top, old style recipe, completely tracked out, small batch, arc, right? Limited release, rules, straight bourbon whiskey. So there's so many, with these things, if you look at them closely, it's not just a singular box and rules with type floating in the middle of it. It's coming up with these little areas where it's almost like little graphics within graphics, little numbers and areas of interest that are sort of, they look like they're a utilitarian sort of design, but it really does add to the overall look and feel to the package. Whether that package just has a hint of vintage and is modern, more like the Anchor craft beer, or whether it's full vintage, like migrant whiskey. So look at some of those details and really try and incorporate when you're doing something that has a vintage feel to it. Or even if you're not, some of those things on packaging really will bring a package to life.